Year 1821. Location, Brandenburg, Prussia. Among the fog-wrapped woods east of Brandenburg, just beyond the boundaries of state cartography, stands the half-forgotten silhouette of the clergy estate of St. Augustin. What little remains is buried in ivy and silence. Between 1807 and 1821, nearly 100 individuals, orphans, seminarians, midwives, and undocumented refugees, entered its gates and never returned. For decades, no questions were asked. The estate belonged to the Prussian Lutheran Church, and within its walls accountability ended. Yet recovered letters, censored correspondence, and one surviving witness point to something far more systematic. This is not a tale of spontaneous violence or banditry. This is a story of bureaucratic murder under the veil of theology, sanctioned neglect, and state-supported erasure. St. Augustine was, by all outward measures, a jewel of the Brandenburg clergy. Founded in 1778 under the patronage of Duke Friedrich Wilhelm II, it served as a rehabilitation retreat for disillusioned clergy, an educational refuge for war orphans, and a doctrinal purification center for foreign-born converts. The Lutheran leadership often cited it in pamphlets and periodicals, presenting its model as a balance between mercy and discipline. Reports described orchards, marble-floored chapels, and hymn-saturated halls where Latin psalms echoed daily. By royal decree, it was exempt from secular oversight. Even the local constabulary deferred to its abbots. But internal logs, preserved only in fragments, paint a far colder picture. Unmarked graves, vanished patients, and a roster of names the church never acknowledged. The clergy estate of St. Augustine was born in the shadow of war. In the final years of the 7 Years' War, Brandenburg's countryside was strewn with disbanded soldiers and displaced families. Epidemics surged in the east, and civil order grew fragile. Seeking a spiritual anchor for the region, Duke Friedrich Wilhelm II commissioned a religious estate, not merely as a sanctuary but as a strategic intervention. The Prussian Lutheran Church, flush with land grants and ecclesiastical power, answered with St. Augustine. The estate rose on confiscated farmland previously owned by a Jewish family driven out during the war. The main building, a granite behemoth with high-gabled roofs and shuttered balconies, was constructed by prisoners of war under military supervision. By 1780 it was operational. A stone arch bore its motto, Puritas per seclusio, purity through seclusion. To the broader public, it became a narrative of redemption. Lutheran periodicals from Berlin described it as a sacred grove of renewal. Children orphaned by cholera were sent there for moral instruction. Fallen clergy found penance in its silent retreats. Even the mentally afflicted, particularly those whose conditions were interpreted as spiritual deviation, were admitted for correction through fasting and scripture. In reality, those who arrived were absorbed into a rigid monastic regime. Days began at 4 a.m. with choral confession, followed by isolation periods that could last for weeks. Meals were plain and rarely varied: dark bread, thin broth, boiled turnips. Writing materials were prohibited without approval. Punishments for defiance were spiritual: complete silence for 7 days, solitary confinement in subterranean rooms, or public flagellation during morning prayers. The estate's spiritual overseer, Abbot Gerwin Messerschmitt, maintained meticulous control over the narrative. Educated in Wittenberg and politically shrewd, Messerschmitt ensured that every outgoing report highlighted charity, sanctity, and Lutheran orthodoxy. He discouraged visitors, preferring instead to send illustrated reports with poetic inscriptions. Inside, dissent was treated as heresy. Those who questioned the structure, and even in whispers, were reassigned to the estate's unmonitored labor fields. From 1791 to 1806, the institution grew. Additional buildings were added: a nursery for younger orphans, a guest house for visiting clergy, and the Hall of Reflection, a stone chapel where confessions were made directly into iron grates, with no priest in sight. Church officials praised its moral rigor. By 1803, the Prussian court declared the estate a spiritual arm of the kingdom. What was never publicized was the human cost. Of the 310 individuals registered between 1792 and 1805, less than 60 would reappear in civil records. Most of the rest were noted as transferred, with no destination listed. The church, under ecclesiastical immunity, was not required to account for the fate of those under its care. Local peasants who worked the surrounding lands whispered of strange convoys at night, carts moving silently down the pine-shrouded road, bearing sacks that never returned. A black-clad figure, believed to be Brother Yakowicz, was seen pouring lime into distant ditches behind the chapel. When questioned, estate officials dismissed these sightings as rural superstition or drunken fantasy. The peasants stopped asking. By the time the Napoleonic Wars swept through Prussia, St. Augustine was seen not as a place of sanctuary, but as a tool of purification. Foreigners, especially Polish Catholics and French-speaking refugees, were redirected there by government intermediaries seeking to erase non-compliant influences. The estate's archives show a sudden surge in admissions between 1807 and 1810. Names vanish after entry. Letters home were intercepted. The French consul's complaints were shelved, and yet the prestige remained. Bishops cited St. Augustine as proof that religious devotion could solve social disarray. In 1812, Messerschmitt received a commendation signed by King Friedrich Wilhelm III. That same year, 6 wet nurses from Pomerania disappeared during a routine assignment to the estate's nursery wing. Their families never received notice. In January of 1813, a letter reached the municipal archive in Potsdam. Written in uneven script and stained with soot, it bore no return address. The writer identified herself as Alena Grotze, a laundress formerly employed at St. Augustine. The letter described rooms where no hymn could reach, and barrels filled not with grain but with the silence of boys. It was promptly dismissed as the product of hysteria. A note in the margin of the municipal ledger reads, "Possibly drunk or disaffected. Do not pursue." Yet this was not the first account to slip through. A decade earlier, in 1802, a deacon from Kustrin had lodged a complaint after failing to retrieve his nephew from the estate. The boy had been sent for moral correction after attempting to convert to Catholicism. After 3 months without word, the deacon rode to St. Augustine himself, but was refused entry. A friar at the gate claimed the boy had absconded. No effort was made to investigate. When the deacon petitioned higher church authorities, he was accused of doctrinal insubordination and reassigned to a rural parish. These silences were intentional. Abbot Messerschmitt, whose authority expanded unchecked, employed a network of loyal subordinates. Chief among them was Prior Karl Strenker, a man with a background in Prussian penal logistics. Before joining the estate, Strenker had overseen prisoner re-education programs in East Pomerania, where he earned a reputation for reducing costs through personnel consolidation. At St. Augustine he applied the same principles. Bodies once deemed spiritually irredeemable became liabilities. Discipline gave way to disposal. Records from 1815, later found in a burnt ledger in the estate's subcellar, list weekly cleansings, with tallied numbers instead of names. One entry, dated September 3rd, reads, 6 unresponsive, 4 relocated, 2 final. Another, in the winter months. Weekly review, 13 considered null, preparation initiated. The terminology was clinical, designed to blur ethics into logistics. The estate's isolation was its greatest shield. The pine forests surrounding it muffled cries and camouflaged the movement of transport carts. No civilian lived within 2 kilometers of the main gate, and those who worked the adjacent fields were rotated regularly, never permitted to linger after sundown. Even supply drivers from Brandenburg were forbidden to unload their wagons. Instead, a designated porter known only as Brother Ort would meet them at a roadside marker, accept the goods, and vanish back into the trees. Brother Ort's name appears in no formal ecclesiastical registry. However, his signature, a jagged O scrawled over a cross, was found on numerous receipt slips discovered in a collapsed storeroom decades later. These slips were bundled with inventory notes that suggest a steady procurement of chloroform, binding cloth, and limestone dust, none of which were listed in the estate's public accounts. Between 1813 and 1816, the number of incoming residents surged. The War of the Sixth Coalition had left swaths of Prussia economically broken, and the Church positioned itself as a remedy. With state encouragement, children orphaned by the war were collected into roving wagons, marked with the sigil of St. Augustine. Mothers, if present, were told the estate would provide religious instruction, nourishment, and eventual return. None of the children came back. A surviving registry from an affiliated orphan intake center in Frankfurt an der Oder lists 42 transfers to the estate in July of 1814 alone. Of these, not a single individual reappears in parish marriage logs, census entries, or death notices. A postscript at the bottom of the document, added in different ink, reads, "No updates received. All correspondence redirected to Diocesan Board." The Church's reach made such redirections seamless. Local officials, many of them deeply entangled with ecclesiastical power, had no incentive to press for transparency. Moreover, the estate's reputation was too valuable. It allowed authorities to present a solution for the growing underclass, the immoral, the infirm, the inconvenient. St. Augustine became a repository for social burden. Among the few who resisted this narrative was Professor Matthias Wundt, a theologian at the University of Berlin. In a series of essays published between 1816 and 1818, Wundt questioned the theological justification for permanent seclusion. He cited anonymous testimonies from former seminarians who spoke of windowless quarters, unexplained disappearances, and days of forced kneeling in cold stone halls. He received death threats. His final essay, titled "In the Absence of Mercy," was removed from university shelves within months of publication. Shortly after, Wundt left Berlin for Vienna. He never wrote publicly again. Those who did escape the estate carried marks not easily explained. One such case emerged in 1820, when a boy of 15, later identified only as Tomasz, was discovered wandering near the Oder River, barefoot and partially mute. After weeks in a municipal infirmary, he scribbled a name on the wall, St. August. He could not recall how he had left. His arms bore symmetrical scars, and his back showed evidence of recent burns. When a journalist from the Berliner Neueste Nachrichten inquired into his past, the article was pulled before print. Tomasz was returned to church custody within days. His later whereabouts remain unknown. The final years of Messerschmidt's rule were marked by administrative concealment. As rumors grew, the estate ceased providing numerical reports. All requests for visitation were denied. Only bishops with written approval from the royal court could enter, and even then their movements were limited. One such bishop, a reformist named Dieter Kranick, later wrote privately that no place on earth had felt more unlit. But the outside world was changing. By 1821, Brandenburg had begun to modernize, and with it came a new generation of civic inspectors less beholden to the church. A review was scheduled for autumn. In preparation, the estate began transferring select residents to smaller chaplaincies or releasing them outright, provided they signed silence pledges. These releases were few. Most who had survived the interior were either too broken to speak or too fearful to try. That same year, a partial collapse of the main dormitory revealed a hidden space beneath the chapel floor. Inside were personal effects never catalogued, dolls, shoes, rosary beads, and a rusted tin containing 13 finger bones. When questioned, Messerschmidt claimed the space was an unused reliquary never finished. No further investigation followed. Of the 98 officially recorded disappearances between 1807 and 1821, only 11 were ever acknowledged in church statements. The rest were attributed to illness, flight, or spiritual decay. To this day, the estate's interior records remain sealed by ecclesiastical decree. The first cracks in the institution's reputation had formed, but still, the silence held. In the spring of 1810, a cartographer named Anselm Kreuser was commissioned to update the ecclesiastical land maps of the Brandenburg province. The commission, funded jointly by the Royal Court and the Prussian Lutheran Council, required him to verify the boundaries of church-held properties and produce a scaled rendering for administrative use. Among the properties listed was the clergy estate of St. Augustine. Kreuser, methodical and exacting, kept a private diary alongside his official sketches. On May 3rd, he recorded a simple observation. They did not permit approach beyond the 4th marker. No windows on the southern wing. The air carried something hidden. Cruce's notes include measurements of walls, recorded gate placements, and a sketched outline of an unusual building not mentioned in church documents, a circular structure with sloped roofing partially sunken, flanked by raised soil mounds. When asked about the anomaly during his final debriefing, he was told that no such structure existed. The drawing was discarded from the official archive. Cruce kept a copy for himself. It would not resurface until decades later, in a personal effects auction in Leipzig. While the public image of St. Augustine remained one of secluded sanctity, inconsistencies had already begun to surface within adjacent parishes. Clergy tasked with accepting transfers or supervising outer facilities reported irregularities, missing identity papers, silence orders with blank signatory fields, and surges in donations tied to unexplained estate losses. The parish of Granzow, tasked with receiving retired clergy from the estate, noted that several arrivals bore no knowledge of the catechism and responded to questioning with pre-written notes or practiced recitations, always in the same phrasing. One such note, found folded in the hymnal of a mute former resident named Brother Elias, read, "The body is his, the mouth is not required." Investigators at the time attributed it to pious abstraction. It was not preserved in any official file. Ignored signs also came from within the theological community. In late 1811, Sister Theresia Lang, a former novice assigned briefly to the estate's infirmary, wrote a confidential letter to her confessor in Jüterbog. She described nightly removals of the ill, often unrecorded. They go in groups of 2 or 3, always the same covered wagon, no prayers, no farewells. She included the initials of 5 women she had nursed personally, each of whom had vanished without entry into the death log. The letter was intercepted. Sister Lang was reassigned to a silent convent in Saxony. The confessor who received the note was later excommunicated for unrelated charges. Even within the estate, cracks began to show. One porter, Johann Mietke, reportedly fled during a supply run in 1812 and sought protection at a tavern near Cottbus. He arrived disoriented, bruised, and unable to speak above a whisper. The innkeeper described him as haunted, like a man chased by something he could not name. Mietke wrote a brief account on a scrap of sailcloth. They keep the doors locked from both sides. They do not ask if you are ready. He died 3 weeks later of unknown causes. No inquest followed. Yet for each alarm raised, the mechanisms of denial grew stronger. The Prussian Lutheran Council issued guidelines for external correspondence, including a clause forbidding descriptions of internal routines. Reports from the estate were reduced to numerical tallies: intake, scripture hours, labor output. Deaths were listed in a consolidated column titled Departures, with no breakdown. One councilman, skeptical of the numbers, made an informal visit in 1814. He was received in the Hall of Reflection, served a modest meal, and presented with 4 boys reciting Latin verse. He later wrote, "What I saw confirmed the purity of their mission. I regret my suspicion." The boys, later identified through indirect testimony, were not residents of St. Augustine at all. They had been brought in from the Stockhouse Seminary for that specific visit, then returned the same night. The deception was orchestrated by Prior Strenker, who routinely prepared staged presentations for visiting clergy. During these performances, estate residents were confined in lower quarters, warned by bell tones not to surface until the signal passed. This system of dual appearances extended to all aspects of estate operation. One room in the northern wing, referred to internally as the library, contained no books, only file cabinets with duplicate records sanitized for inspection. Baptismal records were retyped, omitting dates of transfer. Personnel logs showed individuals still assigned years after their confirmed deaths. One boy, Lucas M., appeared in 15 consecutive rosters with no aging or role change. His name was later found etched into the underside of a pew in the chapel crypt. By 1815, even the estate's suppliers began noting abnormalities. A merchant in Rathenau documented a sharp increase in requisitions for rope, vinegar, and heavy lime. The quantities exceeded what was needed for cleaning or minor construction. When asked, The estate's buyer claimed they were preparing to fumigate an outbreak of plague mildew. No such disease had been reported in the region. The merchant reported the discrepancy to his guild. The guild declined to intervene. Other testimonies came from the periphery. A shepherd named Henning Vols, grazing near the estate's southern edge, reported seeing a figure dragging something across the soil, leaving a wide furrow behind. The local magistrate fined Vols for trespassing and confiscated his flock. His name disappears from records in 1816. Throughout these years, it was the absence of reaction that spoke loudest. Town criers read no notices. The newspapers printed only church-approved circulars. Even among families of the vanished, hope became a posture of compliance. Letters sent to the estate went unanswered or returned with red wax seals and no explanation. Appeals to bishops were acknowledged with vague reassurances or redirected to theological bodies with no investigatory authority. The term Augustine silence began to circulate quietly among clergy in Wittenberg, a euphemism for deliberate omission. Seminaries warned their students to avoid mentioning the estate except in doctrinal terms. Professors who speculated on its operations were encouraged to retire early or accept transfers to less visible posts, but the signs had grown too numerous to remain invisible. One final letter, dated December 1816, reached a minor scribe in the royal chancery. It came from a former gravedigger, now elderly, who had worked on the estate grounds for 7 seasons. He described rows of unmarked plots, 3 per week, filled at dusk. He named specific locations, all outside the designated burial zone. His account ended with the phrase, "There are more stones than names, more names than prayers, more prayers than witnesses." The letter was received. No reply was sent. In early 1817, a clerk named Otto Lambeck was assigned to transcribe financial records from the eastern ecclesiastical provinces for a quarterly audit. Employed by the Office of Diocesan Oversight in Berlin, Lambeck had no personal stake in the institutions he catalogued. His task was arithmetic. Yet as he moved through the ledgers sent from St. Augustin, a pattern emerged. Funding allocations for food, clothing and bedding were calculated based on population estimates that had not changed in over a decade. The monthly figures showed a static count of 137 residents. Not once, across 41 ledgers, did this number fluctuate. No seasonal dips, no death adjustments, no incoming or outgoing transfers. Lambeck raised the issue in a routine margin note. Query discrepancy in headcount consistency. His population fixed by statute. His supervisor struck through the comment in red ink and wrote beneath it, "In matters of St. Augustine, refrain from extrapolation." The original note was not archived. Lambeck continued his transcription in silence. But patterns have weight, even when spoken only in columns. Another clerk, Elise Baum, processing textile supply tallies for the same region, noticed a decline in linen requisitions despite unchanged resident counts. The estate reported fewer worn garments, fewer replacement robes, and fewer infirmary linens. If 137 individuals remained active, the usage data suggested that at least a third no longer required basic material provisions. When she voiced this, she was reassigned to a post cataloguing hymnals. Her notes vanished from the intake log. At the same time, outside Brandenburg, letters began arriving at peripheral seminaries and convents. Each bore variations of the same request. Did they have room to receive a small number of St. Augustine's overflow residents for temporary restoration? The letters described the individuals as doctrinally intact, physically fragile, vocally limited. They emphasized discretion, offering stipends for silent acceptance. Most institutions declined. A few, strapped for funds, agreed. One convent in Dessau took in 3 women whose names were never provided. A sister later described them as responsive only to bell tones, unable to hold utensils, silent save for scripture whispered during storms. When asked where they had come from, the women gave the same reply: "We were made whole." None of them lived beyond 2 winters. Warnings also surfaced in less formal ways. In the margins of estate hymnals donated to outer parishes, fragments of sentences were found etched in ink that faded to brown with age. One read, "Count the nights, not the candles." Another, The floorboards remember. These phrases appeared without author names, and most were dismissed as poetic aberrations. But one hymn book sent to a school in Bernau contained, stitched into its spine, a folded ribbon with 13 tally marks drawn in charcoal. Beneath them, in cramped hand, were the words, "One name for each wall." The walls, in truth, had begun to betray their secrets. A fire in the Eastern Dormitory in 1818 revealed a false panel behind which lay dozens of bundled cloths. Each contained personal effects, hair combs, toy horses, pressed flowers, and once, a child's molar tied with a silk string. When questioned, Prior Strenker claimed they were contraband articles confiscated for spiritual purity. No record exists of what became of the items afterward. The dormitory was rebuilt, this time with thicker masonry. More insistent were the failures of ritual. In 1819, a visiting bishop attended a mass at the estate and noted that the choir's responses were not aligned with the missal. The boys sang in perfect synchrony but several measures behind, as if echoing a different service. The bishop later wrote, "Their mouths moved with intent, but their eyes were fixed on something behind me. I could not shake the sense that the room was reciting a prayer to be heard by someone beneath the floor." That same year, an attempt to implement a standardized catechetical review across all ecclesiastical institutions met silent resistance at St. Augustine. While other estates submitted transcripts of doctrine examinations, the clergy of St. Augustine offered only a brief letter affirming that internal doctrinal soundness remains beyond contest. Attached were 4 pages of copied psalms and a poem titled On Quietude. The inspection was postponed indefinitely. Inside the estate, discipline intensified. The bell tones grew more frequent. Residents were awoken at irregular hours for blind processions through the Hall of Reflection. The lower infirmary was expanded, though records show no increase in illness. One physician brought from Magdeburg for an audit remarked on the absence of patient voices. "They lie in their cots," he wrote, "not as if resting, but as if set aside." He described one boy, no older than 9, whose wrists bore deep symmetrical scarring. The boy blinked but did not speak. When the physician reached for his hand, the child drew a cross on the linen sheet with his finger, then rolled away. The physician was dismissed before sunrise. By 1820, several junior clergy assigned to the estate requested transfers. Their applications were uniformly denied. One of them, Brother Albrecht, attempted escape during a supply trip. He made it as far as the monastery bridge in Ketzin before being apprehended by church deputies. He was returned within hours. His fate is not recorded, but his prayer book was later found by a traveling deacon, wedged behind a loose stone near the bridge. It contained a single handwritten page. "They keep us awake to keep us from remembering. The walls hum when the bells stop. I have not said my name aloud in 5 months. I do not think it belongs to me anymore." The page was torn from the book before it was turned in to church officials. The deacon who found it was reassigned to Danzig. He left no forwarding address, and still the reports continued, each one muffled, each one ignored. At the heart of this silence sat Abbot Messerschmitt, whose authority remained undiminished. He published one final theological essay in 1821 titled On the Necessity of Stillness in Redemption. It argued that salvation required the suppression of worldly voice, the denial of ego through removal from the communal gaze. Redemption, he wrote, was not a return, but an erasure. Few recognized this as more than theology. Fewer still read between the lines. The signs were there. They had been there for years, whispered from behind shut doors, etched into stone, buried in lime. But the silence remained louder. On the morning of September 17, 1821, under orders from the Ministry of Religious Affairs, a discreet inspection party arrived at the gates of St. Augustine. The party consisted of 2 civil magistrates, a physician, a stenographer, and a low-ranking ecclesiastical liaison, all under pretense of performing a structural safety review following reports of soil instability along the western orchard. In truth, the inspection had been ordered by Prince Wilhelm of Prussia, whose cousin had married into a family with connections to one of the disappeared. The delegation carried no official banner and arrived in plain carriages, hoping to observe the estate before it could prepare. They were not permitted entry. Prior Strenker met them at the outer gatehouse with a folded decree, signed by Archbishop von Blaschewitz, exempting the estate from unannounced civil intrusion. The visitors were offered hospitality in a nearby rectory, where they were told an official tour would be arranged, pending liturgical clearance. While they waited, a pair of the inspectors left their quarters at dawn and approached the estate on foot from the north through the forest. What they found never made it into any church-approved account. According to the notes of Magistrate Hermann Daubner, the estate perimeter contained no movement, no audible activity, and no visible residents despite the hour. A chapel bell rang intermittently, but the grounds showed no signs of prayer gathering. Through an upper window, Daubner glimpsed a figure, pale, unmoving, facing the opposite wall, as if placed rather than standing. Beside the window, a rope hung limp with a snapped pulley, suggesting recent damage. No effort to repair it was visible. Later that afternoon, frustrated by the stonewalling, the physician in the group, Dr. Carsten Halber, claimed a sudden onset of illness and requested immediate treatment from the estate's infirmary, a demand which, under health statutes, could not be denied. Strenker, reluctantly, permitted only Halber and one attendant to enter. The others remained behind. What Halber saw inside would not be described publicly for another 23 years, when his private journals were finally released by his grandson in a legal challenge against the church. The infirmary was silent. Of the 10 beds, 8 were occupied by residents showing signs of severe muscular atrophy. None spoke. One opened his mouth repeatedly as if chewing without food. Their arms were bound not with straps, but with simple cloth knots. The windows had been sealed with wax. Halber reported a smell, not of rot, but of spent breath and boiled wool. In the adjoining room, he found a storage wall with dozens of tagged satchels, personal effects, indexed by numbers with no corresponding ledger. Halber, despite his shock, took no immediate action. He wrote a memorandum to the ministry detailing his concerns, but did not press for return access. He had witnessed enough to understand the weight of the opposition. Back outside the estate, word of the attempted inspection reached the diocesan office within 2 days. The clerical liaison, whose loyalty lay with the church, had already telegraphed his account of the event, painting the magistrates as disrespectful and aggressive. By the week's end, all 5 members of the party were placed under temporary suspension for procedural overreach. Their report was never submitted formally. But the visit had triggered a change. Inside the estate, there was a shift in rhythm. Bell tones were suspended for 3 days. The hall of reflection was locked, and residents were kept from the upper floors. In a letter later intercepted by a courier from Wittenberg, one junior cleric wrote, "They are hiding something deeper now. The cellar has been sealed. The lime barrel is gone." The same letter mentioned a name rarely found in official texts, Brother Pius. Described as mute, elderly, and permitted to move freely between the estate's sectors, Pius was believed by some to be a former military chaplain who had taken silence vows after a failed mission in Poland. But among the lower clergy, he held a different reputation. He was the one called when rooms changed purpose. When a resident no longer fit the categories prescribed by the abbot's records, it was Pius who took them. No one knew where. In the months following the aborted inspection, more physical changes were made. Wooden walkways were installed over certain ground sections to discourage direct contact with the soil. Found well near the eastern edge was filled and boarded over. Several chimneys, once used daily, were collapsed and bricked shut. These modifications were not architectural corrections, they were erasures. Passageways once used for quiet movement now ended in blank walls. An entire staircase was removed from the nursery wing. When questioned by an estate steward, Prior Strenker reportedly replied, "The fewer doors, the fewer questions." It was during this period that the first defector successfully escaped with documentation. Her name was Lenora Reske, age 19, employed as a scullery maid. She had arrived at the estate in 1819 under a labor transfer agreement from a small convent near Nauen. By 1821, she had become responsible for cleaning the lower archive room, a space she later described as smelling of salt and copper, like something meant to be hidden in the earth. Over the course of several weeks, She smuggled out loose pages from a torn ledger, folding them into the lining of her apron. The pages contained names, ages, and dates of arrival, none of which matched the church's public rosters. On October 12, 1821, during a supply trip to a nearby village, she slipped away and made contact with a Protestant relief group led by Reverend Wilhelm Fedor. Fedor, a quiet critic of the church's institutional arm, housed her in secrecy for 6 days before helping her flee across the border into Saxony. There, she dictated a statement detailing what she had seen. The statement survives in a brittle folio kept in the historical archives of Dresden. It includes the following passage: "They took the infants at dusk, always dusk. The older ones helped prepare the blankets, but they never stayed to see them go. We were told the children had delicate lungs. They were placed in the lower vault for prayerful rest. I never heard crying once the vault closed." The passage was deemed unreliable due to her diminished moral standing, a phrase used in official rebuttals by church attorneys. Leonora's credibility was attacked, her personal history dissected, her testimony buried under accusations of mental fragility. Yet the ledger pages matched handwriting found in known estate documents, and 3 of the names she cited, Ansel, Mechtilde, and Caroline B., had been listed in early intake records but nowhere else thereafter. It was the first time the church could not entirely dismiss a voice from inside. Still, no prosecution followed. The bishop overseeing the province issued a rare public statement acknowledging the existence of internal inconsistencies, but warned against rash interpretations fueled by malice or misapprehension. A commission was formed but met only twice before being dissolved. The members cited lack of access, archival confusion, and conflicting jurisdiction. In the winter of 1821, under pressure from both church and state, St. Augustine ceased all new admissions, but the doors never opened. By February of 1822, the estate's outward calm had become too perfect. No delivery carts were seen for weeks. The bell, once audible across the pine ridges, ceased entirely. Smoke no longer rose from the kitchen flue. Even the local peasants, who once kept a cautious distance, began to whisper of abandonment. But the estate had not emptied. It had only gone further inward. Inside the stone walls, a different routine had taken hold. The remaining residents, those deemed spiritually stabilized, were no longer permitted to speak even during prayer. Communal hymns were replaced with hand movements taught in silence, gestures lifted from catechetical signs used for the deaf. The Hall of Reflection was opened only once per week, and even then only by Brother Pius. During these sessions, residents were brought in blindfolded, their hands clasped not in reverence but as bindings. What occurred inside remained unrecorded. In March, a narrow breach in the estate's perimeter wall near the refuse trench allowed a village child to slip inside. 12-year-old Friedrich Bormann had been dared by older boys to retrieve a brick from the estate itself, proof of his courage. He did not make it past the southern wing. When he returned, he carried nothing. He spoke of faces with white cloth mouths, and a man who walked without making sound even on gravel. His parents, devout Lutherans, beat him for the trespass and forbade him from repeating the story. But the tale reached a local trader, who relayed it to a clerk in Potsdam, where it was logged without attribution in a packet of rural rumors. That same month, the remaining staff within the estate received orders, not from Abbot Messerschmitt directly, but through sealed directives delivered by courier from Magdeburg. The messages instructed all internal clergy to prepare transition protocols. Though the language was vague, one phrase repeated across the documents: "All unbound shall be reconciled or removed." The exact meaning of reconciliation in this context was never clarified. 2 weeks later, 5 mid-level friars vanished from their posts. Their quarters were found stripped of personal items. Their names were removed from the estate register by hand, ink still wet, when discovered by a maintenance apprentice. No exit documentation was filed. When a junior cleric asked Prior Strenker about their absence, he replied, "They completed their term of silence." Nothing more was said. Among the remaining personnel, one name began to appear more frequently in intercepted notes: novice Klaus Riemer. Assigned to the records chamber, Riemer had spent over a year transcribing intake files, many of which were intentionally fragmented or overwritten. He began collecting fragments into a hidden bundle beneath the floor of his assigned chamber. According to later recovered letters, Riemer grew convinced that certain names appeared not once or twice, but across several years, always with slight alterations. Caroline B. became Carla B., then simply KB, then vanished. Each time, the associated birth year shifted, sometimes forward, sometimes back. Riemer came to believe these names were being reused to mask disappearances. When he attempted to verify physical files in the vault, he was denied access. He began writing to his cousin, a student in Halle, using ciphered verses embedded in psalm translations. His final note read, "The pages are turning without hands. Some names are not meant to rest." On May 6, 1822, novice Riemer was found unconscious at the base of the central stairwell. He survived with broken ribs and a fractured leg. When questioned, he claimed to have slipped while carrying census documents. But a sister in the infirmary later confided, in a letter preserved at the Halle University archive, that Riemer's mouth had been stuffed with communion wafers when he was discovered, packed so tightly he could not speak for 2 days. No record exists of who administered him last rites, though he remained alive for several weeks before succumbing to fever. His burial site was never marked. Inside the estate, tension thickened. Meals were reduced to a single daily bowl of barley gruel. Residents were denied access to the orchard, even under supervision. The nursery wing, long since emptied, was sealed with a wooden cross nailed over the door. Any inquiry was met with a simple reply, "Sanctum est." No one explained what had sanctified it. Then in mid-June a fire broke out in the archive room. The cause was never determined. The flames were quickly contained, but not before reducing 6 shelves of intake records to ash. The responding monks described the fire's origin point as unnatural, its start location being a set of stone shelves without oil, parchment, or fuel. The incident report listed it as an act of God. When asked whether a replacement record would be drawn, Prior Strenker replied, "Those meant to be remembered shall be remembered." It was during this period that external observers, long silenced, began to make their move. Their group of 5 former clergy, all with brief tenures at St. Augustine, formed an informal testimony circle in Leipzig under the guidance of a former seminary professor, Karl Erich Voss. They gathered once per month, documenting shared observations, compiling names, and cross-referencing notes. By late July, they had amassed over 70 names of individuals known to have entered the estate, but with no evidence of departure, burial, or reassignment. Their goal was to submit a full dossier to the Ministry of Ecclesiastical Oversight in Dresden. They never made the delivery. On August 2, 1822, the home of Professor Voss was broken into. His manuscripts were taken, his records burned in the stove, and his left hand broken in 2 places. No robbery was reported. The local constable logged the event as a domestic accident. Of the 5 clerics in his circle, 3 disappeared within the year. The 2 who remained fled to Denmark under false names. One of them, decades later, would confess in a Danish periodical under the initials J.K. and describe St. Augustine as a mechanism for the quiet murder of the forgotten, blessed only by the indifference of ritual. Inside the estate, the final preparations had begun. One by one, the chapel icons were removed. Statues were cloaked in white linen. The main crucifix was relocated from the Hall of Reflection to the cellar, a move justified by Strenker as the realignment of devotion. Confession ceased altogether. Residents were not given an explanation. Then, for the first time in 14 years, a letter left the estate unfiltered. It was addressed to the widow of a former bishop, a woman named Emily Schwann, known for her correspondence with orphanages across Prussia. The letter bore no signature. It read only, "Your son is not buried. He is beneath the bell." The son in question, Matthias Schwann, had entered St. Augustine in 1811 at the age of 7 for religious redirection. No record existed of his exit. Emily brought the letter to a Protestant syndicate in Frankfurt, which, under mounting political pressure from reformist parties, pushed for a formal inquiry. Their request was denied. But Emily did not relent. She hired a private investigator, a former military scout named Emil Leuschner, and sent him to Brandenburg. Leuschner arrived in September, and he did not go alone. On September 19, 1822, Emil Leuschner crossed the northern tree line of the Brandenburg pinewood, accompanied by two men posing as forest surveyors. One carried a charcoal case filled with instruments, the other a notebook of topographic sketches predated to avoid suspicion. Leuschner had no legal sanction, no magistrate's writ. What he carried instead were 4 pages torn from an estate roster, recovered by Emily Schwann through anonymous post. 3 of the names belonged to children declared dead. The 4th matched a boy seen briefly in a Frankfurt infirmary, mute and with a branded cross beneath his left shoulder blade. They entered the estate perimeter by dusk. The wall breach used by young Friedrich Bormann had been sealed with mortar and lime, but a drainage trough ran beneath the western orchard. The men crawled through it, emerging behind the unused granary. No guards patrolled the yard, no dogs barked. A smell hung low to the soil, part damp iron, part spent oil. Above them, the upper shutters of the dormitory hung open, unmoving. They split. One man remained at the granary to record any movement. The other traced a line south toward the chapel entrance. Leuschner entered through the infirmary's rear. The door was unlatched. Inside, he found what he would later describe in a private affidavit as not a place of rest but of curation without intent. The beds were occupied, but the figures within showed no sign of reaction. One resident had no eyelids. Another's hands were bound not at the wrists but above the elbows as if to restrict prayer. A thin woman lay upright in her cot, staring directly at the ceiling joist where a child's sock had been nailed like a talisman. When Leuschner approached, she opened her mouth and said one word, 3. He did not know what it meant. He moved on. In the adjacent room, a spiral stair led downward. The walls narrowed, the air cooled. He descended 30 steps into what estate diagrams referred to only as lower storage. It was not storage. The room was empty of furniture. The floor, stone and uneven, had been scrubbed clean, but the central feature was unmistakable. An iron ring embedded in the center of the floor bolted through a stone cover. Around it, faded red chalk markings formed concentric circles. Leuschner, trained to note minute terrain details, described the floor as repeatedly disturbed and resealed. Dust pooled unevenly. The scent of burnt cloth lingered. He marked the position in his sketch map and ascended. As he reached the infirmary threshold, he heard it, a chime, thin and irregular, from above. Not a bell, metal striking wood. It continued for 12 counts. Then silence. Outside, his partners reconvened. The surveyor had witnessed movement behind the chapel's stained glass window, a figure in white, head bowed, hands moving in tight, repetitive gestures. The sketch artist reported a freshly dug plot behind the nursery wing, covered by an overturned rain barrel. They agreed to leave before full daylight. The orchard shadows would conceal them until the tree line. They returned to Frankfurt by carriage, arriving the morning of September 22nd. Within a week, Leuschner delivered his map, notes and sketches to Emily Schwann. She copied everything twice. One copy was mailed anonymously to the Office of Ecclesiastical Land Management in Dresden. The other she hand-carried to a reformist envoy in Berlin. For the first time, the state responded. On October 5, 1822, a royal commission was established under civil authority. Though limited in scope, its purpose was clear: to assess whether St. Augustin had violated land use charters and health ordinances. It was not empowered to question doctrinal practices or sacramental operations. The Church retained autonomy over all spiritual matters. But the inspection mandate included one clause, added late by a reformist aide. If structural mismanagement endangers bodily persons within ecclesiastical grounds, the state reserves right of remediation. The commission arrived unannounced on October 14th. This time they brought guards. The outer gates of the estate were open. No one stood watch. The visiting party consisted of 2 magistrates, a military engineer, a legal recorder, and 4 riflemen. They entered without resistance. What they found would never be entered into public record. The official report, later sealed in the ministry archive, was only partially preserved through unofficial transcripts leaked in 1847. According to these accounts, the estate was devoid of staff. No priests, no novices, no children, but they found bodies. In the Hall of Reflection, 24 residents sat on benches facing the altar, all dressed in ceremonial linen. None moved. Upon approach, the magistrates found that all were deceased, hands bound in prayer, mouths sewn shut with fine thread. A single placard above the altar read, "Silence is not absence, it is return." In the nursery wing, 6 cribs were found. In 3, bundles of cloth weighted with stone. In the others, nothing. No sign of recent use, no smell of milk or soiled linens. The cribs were nailed to the floor. In the infirmary, only 2 bodies remained. One, an adult male later identified as Brother Pius, sat upright in a chair, eyes open, lips stitched. A silver cross had been inserted into his throat, point first. The other body was unidentifiable, burned beyond recognition, left inside a cast-iron laundry boiler. The cellar beneath the eastern chapel contained the largest discovery. Behind a false wall, the commission found 12 compartments, each the size of a small chamber. In them, layered with lime and soil, were bodies. None were embalmed. Some bore signs of restraint. Others had been wrapped in ecclesiastical robes as if for burial, yet left exposed. The air was thick with damp rot and rust. One of the magistrates vomited before fainting. Another wept openly. In total, 31 bodies were recovered. Only 5 could be named. The estate was closed that day, the gates were sealed, guards posted, but the church moved quickly. Before the week ended, the Archbishop declared the estate an abandoned theological precinct and reclaimed authority. The Civil Commission was dissolved. The inspector's notes were seized. All findings were classified as internal clerical matter. No public trial occurred, no charges were filed. By November, the estate had vanished from state maps. Its land was listed as non-arable sanctuary acreage. The structures were left to decay. Peasants were warned not to approach. Travelers were told the site was infected with soil sickness. By winter, only the chapel roof remained visible above the snow. In a final letter written to her niece in Lübeck, Emily Schwann wrote, "He is not there, but what was done to him and to the others cannot remain hidden. They made a silence so complete that it swallowed records, but not memory, not mine." She died that spring. In the spring of 1823, the estate of St. Augustine remained visible only in rumour. The building still stood, but official routes diverted around them. Forestry maps redrew the boundaries of the surrounding pinelands, labelling the region as Restricted Growth Reserve. Local children were warned away with stories of falling roofs and poisoned wells. The church no longer acknowledged the estate's operational history. In catechism manuals printed after 1824, it ceased to exist entirely, yet traces remained. A year after the closure, a groundskeeper from the neighbouring parish of Golm discovered a bundle buried near the base of the northern retaining wall. It was wrapped in waxed cloth and tied with rosary string. Inside, 13 torn pages from estate registries, each bearing crossed-out names and annotations in 2 hands. One entry read, Bastian H. Unsuitable for recitation, reassigned below. Another, Rosalinde, respiratory intervention failed, transferred to Sanctum. These notes, written in cramped Latin, were never translated officially. The bundle was handed to the regional archivist in Potsdam, who filed them under anonymous writings ecclesiastical miscellanea. In 1831, the orphanage at Spandau received a boy of approximately 10 years old, found wandering near the disused Brandenburg trade route. He wore linen robes dyed grey with ash and did not speak for 2 weeks. When he did, he repeated the same phrase in Prussian-accented Latin, "We were meant to hum, not to think." A physician chalked it up to fever-induced babble. The boy was renamed Matthias and entered the orphan roll. No attempt was made to trace his origins. Years later, in the margin of a discipline log, a caretaker scribbled, "Matthias walks in silence even when no one is watching. When he prays, his hands never touch." By 1840, much of the estate's structure had collapsed from neglect. The roof of the nursery wing caved in during a storm. Wild ivy overtook the granary. The Hall of Reflection, once the central axis of ritual control, sank 3 inches into the marshy soil. Still, no demolition order was issued. The land remained consecrated, inaccessible, without high-level ecclesiastical approval. It was during this period that Professor Gerhard Leuschner, grandson of Emil, unearthed his family's collection of estate materials. A historian by training, Gerhard had grown up hearing only fragments of what his grandfather had witnessed. After his father's death, he found a cedar box labeled Augustine. Inside, maps, rosters, a stitched ribbon bearing tally marks, and the original field sketches of the estate's subterranean compartments. Gerhard began writing. In 1847, he published a small volume, privately printed in Halle, titled Silence by Order. Though framed as speculative research, it presented transcriptions of testimonies, sketches of unreleased diagrams, and references to the unsealed burial chamber. The book was immediately condemned by the Prussian Lutheran Synod as defamatory. Sales were halted. Remaining copies were seized from bookstores by clerical deputies. Only 17 are known to survive. In response, Gerhard delivered public lectures at minor universities, framing St. Augustine not as an aberration, but as the inevitable result of unchecked ecclesiastical insulation. When the mouth of prayer replaces the eyes of witness, he said at Heidelberg, we are left not with salvation but with sanctioned forgetting. His lectures drew protest. 2 universities revoked his invitations. In Kassel, students sympathetic to the church pelted him with ash during a sermon. Still, he continued. Across these years, small clues continued to surface. A gravekeeper in Gollwitz unearthed 3 bodies buried outside his registry, all wrapped in cloth bearing the mark of the Augustine order. 2 were adults. 1 was no older than 8, no headstones, no coffin wood. The cloth had been stitched with the word redeemed. The gravekeeper sent word to his local bishop, who responded with a standard decree. Such finds are the burden of history, not the weight of the present. The bodies were interred in silence. The gravekeeper resigned the following winter. In 1855, an architectural survey of abandoned rural structures catalogued what remained of the estate. The chapel still stood, but its interior had warped. The floor slanted toward the altar, now cracked. In the Hall of Reflection, surveyors noted that the walls bore deep impressions beneath the plaster, as if benches had once been bolted directly into stone. Behind the altar, they found a cavity filled with earth. Inside, a single doll's head, made of porcelain, its mouth carefully removed. The surveyors took no further notes. Their sketches were filed in the Department of Rural Constructions, Drawer 8C. One of them, in a private letter to his wife, wrote, "It felt like something had ended too carefully, like someone was trying to remember how to forget." Despite mounting evidence, the church refused all calls for investigation. In a statement published in 1860, the Diocesan Council of Brandenburg wrote, "No institution bearing the name St. Augustine has ever received formal ecclesiastical charter under current doctrine. Any references thereto are matters of private imagination or historical conflation." Yet survivors remained. In 1863, a nun known only as Sister Mart delivered a confession to a deacon in Leipzig. Frail and nearly blind, she spoke for 90 minutes. The deacon, stunned by what he heard, wrote a summary account that was later entered into a locked drawer of the diocesan archive. In it, she described feeding infants broth infused with laudanum, of covering windows with tar cloth, of watching silent boys dragged from their beds for the final devotion. Marta died 3 weeks later. Her grave was marked only with her order number. The deacon who heard her confession transferred to France within the year. Public memory of the estate faded. By the late 19th century, St. Augustine appeared only in obscure treatises, footnotes, and the occasional whispered warning passed from old farmer to grandchild. Children were told not to wander too far past the black pine, where the prayers have no sound. No signs remained, no plaques, no monument. In 1912, a railway was constructed through the outer woods of Brandenburg. During the initial dig, workers struck an unexpected foundation beneath a low ridge. It was part of the old dormitory wall. The foreman reported a vault door cracked down its center. When a worker attempted to pry it open, a state inspector halted the effort. The structure was deemed unstable and reburied. Tracks were laid over it. The train would pass through twice daily, its whistle rising over soil packed with unmarked names. And so the legacy of St. Augustine survived, not through doctrine, not through justice, but through residue. Uneven bricks, altered records, quiet gestures in orphanages from children who had never seen the place but somehow knew when to bow. A silence preserved not by piety, but by design. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.